What if the most important military operation of the Iran war was the one that never happened? Imagine a mountain of concrete and collapsed earth. Beneath it, somewhere inside Iran, sits material that could become the foundation of a nuclear arsenal. The bombs have already fallen. The tunnels have already collapsed. And yet the uranium is still there. For Tehran, that was supposed to be the end of the story. Bury it, hide it. Wait for Washington to lose interest. Wait for the political pressure to fade. Because there was one assumption beneath the entire strategy. America might destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but America would never send soldiers into Iran to dig it back out. That assumption was about to be tested. And the first sign that something had changed was not a missile launch. It was a phone call. In May, General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reportedly cut short a meeting with senior NATO officials in Brussels and flew back to the United States. His destination was U.S. Central Command headquarters in Tampa, Florida. The subject was reportedly so sensitive that military officials did not want to discuss it through electronic communications. Even over secure networks, that alone would have been significant. But then came the force movements, and suddenly, the rubble covering Iran's nuclear program looked very different. Because the hero of this story is not the B-5 bomber. It is not the missile. It is not even the uranium. It is the buried facility itself. The bunker, the hole in the ground that Iran believed could protect its most valuable strategic asset. And that bunker created a strange contradiction. The deeper Iran buried its nuclear material, the more difficult it became to destroy from the air. But the harder it became to destroy from the air, the more attractive a ground operation became. The bunker was supposed to make the uranium untouchable. Instead, it may have turned the uranium into a problem Washington could no longer ignore. That is where the story becomes much larger than a bombing campaign. Because in modern warfare, destroying a target and controlling what survives are two completely different missions. During Operation Midnight Hammer, American and Israeli strikes hit major Iranian nuclear facilities, including Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, above ground. The damage was visible. Satellite images showed destruction. Tunnel entrances collapsed. Concrete and debris filled access points. From the outside, the nuclear program appeared to have been pushed underground in the most literal sense possible. But then came the question nobody could answer. What was still underneath? Iranian officials understood the strategic value of uncertainty. If inspectors could not enter, outsiders could not easily verify what remained. If the uranium was buried beneath rubble, physically reaching it could require something much more dangerous than another airstrike. And if recovering it meant sending American troops onto Iranian soil, Tehran could reasonably expect Washington to hesitate. That was the calculation. But here is the problem. The rubble may have protected the material from bombs. It did not necessarily protect it from pressure, according to reporting from CNN and the Washington Post. American planners began examining a mission that sounded almost impossible. Heavy excavation equipment would have to reach the destroyed sites. A temporary runway might need to be constructed near the target area. Cargo aircraft would have to operate in hostile territory. Specialized personnel would have to locate and secure nuclear material. And all of this would have to happen while American forces protected themselves from drones, missiles, surviving air defenses, and potentially booby-trapped tunnels. The visual is almost surreal. A C-FA cargo aircraft approaching a hastily constructed runway. Helicopters carrying heavy equipment into a landscape already scarred by airstrikes. Engineers preparing to cut through tons of concrete. And somewhere nearby, American soldiers securing a perimeter while everyone waits to see whether the ground itself is trapped. This was not simply an extraction mission. It was a military operation designed to finish what the air campaign could not. And then another contradiction appeared. The United States had overwhelming military power. But overwhelming power does not eliminate risk. It can create new risks. The more specialized the mission became, the more vulnerable it became to a single failure. One trapped tunnel, one surviving missile battery, one drone swarm, one miscalculation. The entire operation could become a political disaster. That is why the reported movement of the Phéandie Airborne Division mattered. This was not an ordinary deployment. The division's traditional mission includes airborne forcible entry, rapidly entering hostile territory, securing critical infrastructure, and creating the conditions for follow-on forces. At the same time, the Phased Marine Expeditionary Unit was moving through the Gulf region aboard the USS Tripoli. Suddenly, the pieces began to resemble a larger picture. Air power had destroyed the visible infrastructure. Now ground forces were preparing for the possibility that the invisible part of the mission might require boots on the ground, and the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Iran had buried its nuclear material to prevent America from reaching it. But the deeper the material was buried, the more Washington had to consider reaching it directly. The bunker had changed the battlefield. It had moved the conflict from the sky to the ground. And then came the question that could determine whether the entire operation was real. Was Washington actually prepared to execute it? The answer may have been sitting in Tampa when General Kane reportedly briefed President Trump on the available options. The mission was not immediately approved, but it was not simply discarded either. It was reportedly placed on hold. That distinction matters. A canceled operation disappears. A paused operation remains a possibility. And a possibility can become leverage. The president was reportedly warned about the risks: Iranian retaliation, a wider regional war, global economic disruption, and American casualties. Because this was no longer a bombing campaign where the aircraft could strike from thousands of feet above the target. This was different. Soldiers would have to enter secure. Dig, search, extract, and leave. Every step created another opportunity for something to go wrong. And far away from the battlefield, another image was beginning to form. Inside the White House, military planners were calculating casualty estimates. Inside Tehran, negotiators were calculating something else. How far was Washington actually willing to go? That was the hidden confrontation. Not missile against missile, not aircraft against air defense, but decision against decision. And this is where the story begins to change. Because Iran's buried uranium was never only a nuclear problem. It was becoming a test of military credibility. And if Tehran believed America would never cross the final line, then every negotiation would eventually return to the same question. What happens when diplomacy fails? The answer suddenly was no longer theoretical. It had a runway, it had cargo air, it had engineers, and it had soldiers waiting nearby. But the most dangerous part was still ahead, because Washington did not necessarily need to launch the mission to make Iran believe it was real. It only needed Tehran to believe that America might. And that is where the battlefield moves underground. Everyone thought this war was about destroying Iran's nuclear facilities. But the real war, convincing Iran that the United States was willing to do what Tehran believed America would never do. That changes everything. Because military power is not only measured by what an army can destroy, it is measured by what the enemy believes that army is prepared to risk. The ground operation was dangerous precisely because it was credible. The Phéandie Airborne was not a symbol. The Marines were not a symbol. The planning for excavation, airfields, security, and nuclear material handling was not a symbol together. They created a possibility, and possibility can be more powerful than action. Because once an adversary believes you might actually cross the line, every decision made before that line becomes more complicated. Inside Tehran, the calculation was no longer simply, can we survive another airstrike? It became, can we survive what comes after the airstrike? That was the strategic transformation. The bombs had damaged the infrastructure. But the threat of the ground operation was attacking something deeper. Iran's assumption about American political will. And the timing mattered, because Iran was not negotiating from a position of unlimited strength. Its military infrastructure had been degraded. Its missile and drone capabilities had been damaged. Its economy was under pressure. And inside the country, public frustration was becoming another battlefield. This is where military power meets economics. A government can survive foreign pressure for years, but foreign pressure becomes much harder to absorb when the population is already struggling. According to leaked polling cited in reporting at the time, large portions of the Iranian population were calling for major political reform, while many reported serious difficulty affording basic necessities. Whether every figure in those reports is accurate is less important than the strategic problem they reveal. A government facing external attack and internal dissatisfaction has fewer options. Every additional military escalation carries a political cost. Every concession carries another. The leadership is forced to calculate not just what its enemies might do, but what its own population might tolerate. And that is the invisible battlefield. The real vulnerability is not. It is political endurance. It is economic pressure. It is uncertainty. And suddenly, the uranium buried beneath the rubble becomes a bargaining chip in a much larger system. Then came the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. One provision became especially important: the commitment to downblend Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium under international supervision. On paper, it looked like a major concession. But here is the contradiction. Downblending is not the same thing as eliminating the ability to enrich. The material can be diluted, but the technical knowledge can remain. The centrifuges can be rebuilt. The infrastructure can potentially return. So the question changed again. Was the agreement actually removing the nuclear threat, or was it simply buying time? That distinction may determine the future of the entire confrontation, because the physical destruction of a facility does not necessarily destroy the capability that created it. Technology survives people. Knowledge survives buildings. And industrial capacity can be rebuilt. The lesson here is uncomfortable. A military strike can destroy infrastructure. It cannot easily destroy expertise. And that means the battlefield is no longer only Iran's mountains and underground tunnels. It is also the global industrial system. The engineers, the supply chains, the components, the financing, the inspections, the political agreements that determine whether reconstruction is possible. This is why the nuclear question cannot be separated from geopolitics. The United States wants verification. Iran wants sovereignty. Europe wants stability. Israel wants a permanent reduction in the nuclear threat. The Gulf states want to avoid becoming the battlefield for the next war. And the global economy wants one thing above all, because every time the Strait of Hormuz becomes part of the conflict, the consequences move far beyond the Middle East. Oil markets react. Shipping costs rise. Insurance premiums increase. Governments prepare emergency plans. And suddenly, a buried canister of uranium in Iran becomes connected to the price of energy thousands of miles away. That is the deeper battlefield, not the tunnel. The system around the tunnel. But there is still one unresolved problem. Nobody can say with absolute confidence where all of Iran's enriched uranium is. That uncertainty is strategically dangerous. If the material remains underground, it is difficult to verify. If it was moved before the strikes, locating it becomes even harder. If inspectors cannot gain full access, the entire agreement depends on trust. And trust is exactly what nuclear diplomacy is designed not to require. The question is no longer whether Iran can hide uranium. The question is whether the international system can prove where it is. That is a completely different problem, and it is one that air power cannot solve. This is why the ground mission that never launched may have been strategically important. Its purpose may never have been to dig. Its purpose may have been to convince Tehran that Washington was willing to dig. That is the paradox of deterrence. The most effective military operation may be the one that never happens, but only if the enemy believes it. For Iran, the buried uranium was supposed to create safety. Instead, it created a strategic dilemma. Leave it buried, and the United States has a reason to keep pressure alive. Bring it out, and the material becomes vulnerable. Agree to dilute it, and the nuclear leverage decreases. Refuse, and the military option returns. There is no perfect choice. And that is precisely what makes the situation dangerous. Because the 60-day negotiating window does not solve the problem. It compresses it. Verification, permanent dismantlement, inspection access, sanctions enforcement, and the question of what happens if Iran reverses course. These issues remain. And if diplomacy fails, the military plan does not have to be invented again. It already exists. That may be the most important strategic lesson of all. The United States did not necessarily need to send soldiers into Iran to demonstrate military credibility. It needed to show that the option had been seriously considered, that the logistics had been studied, that the risks had been calculated, that the forces could move, and that the political leadership might actually authorize it. The rubble bought Iran time, but it may not have bought Iran safety, because the deeper the uranium went, the more the conflict shifted from destruction to extraction, from air power to ground power, from weapons to logistics, from military action to political will, and from the visible battlefield to the invisible one. The question is no longer whether the United States can destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure. It already demonstrated that it can damage it. The real question is whether Washington can permanently control what survives the destruction, because that is the problem modern warfare keeps returning to. You can destroy a building, you can collapse a tunnel, you can crater a runway, but you cannot bomb uncertainty out of existence. And you cannot guarantee that a buried capability will never return. So the final question is not whether the ground operation should have happened. It is whether the threat of that operation was enough to change Iran's strategic calculation, or whether Tehran simply traded one delay tactic for another. And if the uranium is still there, months from now, hidden somewhere beneath Iran's mountains, or inside a facility the world cannot inspect, will history remember this as a successful act of deterrence, or simply the beginning of the next nuclear crisis?